calls the mechanical trap. So why are everyday costs soaring while corporate consolidation just keeps growing? It's something almost all of us have probably wondered about while staring at our monthly budgets. Well, Roundtree's reports argue this isn't just some accident of the free market. Actually, the author presents a pretty compelling case that it's the direct result of a highly engineered, interconnected system deliberately designed to function exactly this way.
To really wrap our heads around this theory, we first need to look at Roundtree's definition of state managerial capitalism. It's described as this operational reality where state power and private corporate capital essentially form an alliance. They work together to consolidate supply chains, create these massive entry barriers, and shield monopolies from standard market discipline. The text outlines that this alliance forms a mechanical trap, which is basically a set of interconnected policies that fundamentally squeeze the working class.
Here's how we're going to break down this complex machine today. First, we'll look at the architecture of the trap. Then, the monopoly loophole. Next, squeezing the family farm, followed by energy, debt, and policy. And finally, we'll look at the decentralized blueprint.
All right, part 1, the architecture of the trap. Let's look at the monetary engine.
We're starting with the very foundation here. Roundtree points to the 1970s as a major inflection point in global economics, specifically focusing on the unanchoring of the US dollar from the gold standard, which fundamentally altered the whole landscape of wealth and debt. Now get a load of the staggering number, 13,288%. That represents the massive increase in gold prices since the 1971 Nixon shock ended the gold standard. Roundtree argues that severing this link unleashed perpetual fiat inflation. So what does that mean for you and me? Well, according to the report, it means a continuously collapsing purchasing power for everyday Americans. It's literally the foundational gear that keeps this mechanical trap spinning. Moving on to part 2, the monopoly loophole. This is the legal shift that Roundtree claims allowed massive corporate consolidation to happen right under the government's nose. You really have to contrast the historical legal standard with today to see it. The 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act was originally designed to prevent any single corporation from getting too big, crushing small businesses, or exploiting workers. Makes sense, right? But under the 1970s Consumer Welfare Standard, a monopoly is only considered illegal if it directly raises retail shelf prices for the consumer. The author argues this is a huge loophole. It legally allows megacorporations to crush local supply chains and worker wages, just as long as they keep those retail prices artificially low. Roundtree gives some fascinating examples of this structural manipulation across a bunch of different industries. Like, historically, Standard Oil's famous 1911 breakup. It actually tripled John D. Rockefeller's wealth through geographic division, basically maintaining a synchronized oligopoly. Fast forward to today, and we see healthcare monopolies using certificate of need laws and pharmacy benefit managers to aggressively block out competition. I mean, even your home isn't immune. Utility monopolies are protected by the state as natural monopolies, which ensures them a steady, lucrative base of captive customers who literally can't legally switch providers. That brings us to part 3, squeezing the family farm. The author argues that the independent, generational family farm hasn't just naturally faded away. It's been systematically dismantled.
Now, this agricultural squeeze definitely didn't happen overnight. It started back in 1973 when the FDA redefined imitation food based merely on synthetic nutrient matching. This was then legally validated by a 1976 court case, which completely opened the floodgates for cheap, ultra-processed foods. Then, just a year later, the McGovern report's science-based warnings about sugar were totally neutralized by corporate lobbying. Concurrently, you had Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz mandating that farmers get big or get out. The whole thing culminated in the 2008 financial crisis, which triggered a massive institutional enclosure of farmland by Wall Street. Roundtree connects all these dots to show a deliberate policy shift that basically forced farmers into massive, debt-fueled monocropping. So how does this actually affect farmers on the ground? Well, let's look at some real data from Oklahoma counties. Institutional landlords demand these rigid, sticky cash rents that stay artificially high. And in a lot of cases, the rents are locked in or even completely suppressed from public view to protect the large landholders. This aggressively squeezes tenant farmers. They end up bearing all the operational risk, even when global crop revenues completely plummet.
The human cost of this squeeze is just stark. 140,000. That's how many independent farms were lost in the United States between 2017 and 2022 alone, according to the report. Roundtree points out that this terminal phase of this squeeze often ends in Chapter 12 bankruptcy. The family farm is liquidated, the community suffers, and the land just gets systematically absorbed into massive corporate and institutional portfolios.
On to part 4, energy, debt, and policy, or what the author calls the volatility loop.
Let's take the renewable fuel standard established in 2005. The intent there was to reduce reliance on foreign oil after Hurricane Katrina by mandating domestic ethanol blending. Good intention, right? But the reality is that it sparked a massive food versus fuel conflict. It converted 7 million acres of native habitat to corn and actually lowered fuel energy density. Roundtree argues this government-mandated market created some pretty severe unintended consequences, ultimately making both food and fuel more expensive for all of us.
And this environmental volatility acts like a massive feedback loop. NOAA data shows that back in the 1980s, the U.S. faced about $3.3 billion climate disasters a year, and we had about 82 days to recover between events. But fast forward to the 2020 through 2024 period, we're seeing 23 events a year with only 16 to 19 days between them. The author illustrates that this increasingly frequent devastation really strains the national debt, which the government pays for by borrowing, and that just further accelerates fiat inflation and tightens the trap.
Which brings us to the final gear of the trap: information arbitrage. Between 2023 and 2024, the S&P 500 grew by a respectable 23.3%. But get this, the average trading Republican representative saw 26% gains, and the average trading Democratic representative saw 31% gains. Roundtree highlights that the legislative class consistently outperforms the market. Why? Because of their control over regulation and their access to geopolitical intelligence, which allows them to profit from the very systems that squeeze the public.
So, if this mechanical trap is really as pervasive as the author claims, how on earth do we get out of it? Well, that brings us to part 5, the decentralized blueprint. Roundtree outlines the DEBB, or the Decentralized Energy Birthright Blueprint. This is defined as a proposed grassroots infrastructure that utilizes abandoned industrial assets and organic waste to create localized, community-owned energy grids. Basically, it's an exact blueprint for pushing back against state managerial capitalism, and notably, doing it without waiting around for or relying on legislative reform. Here's exactly how Roundtree's blueprint would work in practice. First, communities audit and secure abandoned, capped oil and gas wells. Next, they source high-energy organic waste from local slaughterhouses. Then, they inject this slurry deep into the wells, utilizing the Earth's natural thermal gradient as this massive subterranean anaerobic digester. Finally, they capture the localized methane for community power and extract the digestate to use as a natural agricultural fertilizer. The author claims that by using localized physics and salvaged parts, communities can completely bypass corporate utility grids. Another pretty radical proposal for energy independence: harnessing corporate waste heat. The idea here is to tap into the cooling loops of massive corporate data centers and actually reroute their thermal exhaust plumes to provide primary winter heating for local community grids. It's a really ingenious concept about taking a corporate byproduct and turning it into a localized public asset. To sum up the core philosophy of this text, let's read Roundtree's rallying cry. The corporate state relies entirely on our collective disorganization and psychological dependency. Our shared mechanical capability is the one variable they cannot control. That quote perfectly summarizes the author's intense advocacy for manual labor, localized engineering, and mechanical self-reliance over corporate compliance. We've covered a vast amount of ground today, looking at the monetary, legal, agricultural, and energetic gears of the mechanical trap, along with these proposed decentralized solutions. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to reflect on. If the mechanical trap continues to tighten, how resilient is your own community's regional infrastructure? Take a look around at your local systems, assess your vulnerabilities, and really consider the potential power of decentralization. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.